Okay, so we're going to continue by discussing genetically modified animals, and the one pictured on the right is the Aqua Advantage salmon. It is a genetically modified, genetically altered salmon that was produced in 1989, but it wasn't approved by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration until 2015. The Aqua Advantage salmon has been modified with a growth hormone regulating gene from a Pacific Chinook salmon, and also with a prompter gene from another fish called the ocean pout. These two genes were added to the Atlantic salmon to produce a more rapid growing salmon that gets larger in size than a native or natural salmon. The Federal Drug Administration and the Federal Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act determined that Aqua Advantage salmon met the requirements for safety and effectiveness. They also say that the DNA added to the Atlantic salmon is safe for the fish as well. When it comes to comparing the natural salmon to the genetically modified salmon, the natural salmon is the smaller one in the picture. It's typically about 13 inches long and it weighs about 2.8 pounds. The genetically modified Aqua Advantage salmon is 24 inches long, almost double the length, and about 6.6 pounds, almost double the weight. Now, one precaution that they're taking is that the Aqua Advantage salmon are only females and they're also sterile. So if they, for some reason, are introduced into the wild, they are not able to reproduce. Also, the Aqua Advantage salmon reaches maturity at about 1.5 years old, and it takes the standard salmon over 3 years to reach maturity. The scientific literature on the health effects of GMO crops and genetically modified organisms falls into 3 clusters. One group of authors, Cluster 1, states that there's no need for testing GMO products as long as you know the protein coded by the transferred genes and the host organisms. The transgenic products are considered as safe or safer than traditional hybrid crops or other non-transgenic methods. Another group of authors, Cluster 2, makes a strong claim that each GMO product must be tested for a variety of possible effects. They assert that science cannot predict or claim that a product of genetic modification is safe without undertaking a testing program that includes multi-year and multi-generational tests in animals fed on the transgenic crop, or if you're dealing with the Aqua Advantage salmon, some means of testing the impact of eating genetically modified salmon over multi-years as well as multi-generations. Finally, a third group of scientific authors, Cluster 3, asserts in their published articles that some GMO crops, when fed to animals, have exhibited harmful effects compared to non-GMO controls, and these results should draw attention to human health concerns for the future. So, recognizing there's 3 varied scientific groupings and conclusions about GMOs, it's hard to conclude that the science on health effects of GMOs has been resolved within the scientific community. There just isn't a full agreement yet in regards to genetically modified organisms. So the United States and Canada are 2 countries that have lagged behind in regards to requiring genetically modified labels on foods that contain genetically modified content. So what has happened in the U.S. is that numerous states, 26 states, have proposed genetically modified labeling requirements. 24 states have no GMO labeling requirements. So, nearly 50% of the U.S. states have introduced bills requiring labeling or prohibiting genetically modified foods within their particular state. In 2014, Vermont passed a law requiring labeling of GMOs that was to take effect in 2016. It was called the Vermont Genetically Engineered Food Labeling Act. Vermont isn't the first state to require labeling of certain genetically modified foods. Alaska actually enacted a labeling requirement for genetically modified salmon back in 2005, but Vermont's law was the first to require the vast majority of foods sold in the state to be labeled as produced by genetic engineering. So, what about genetically modified labeling requirements around the world? Globally, 64 countries require the labeling of food that contain genetically modified ingredients. Prior to the year of 2016, the U.S. did not have such a labeling requirement, even though about 90% of the public wanted to have such information included on the food label. This is largely because some seed and food companies lobbied the U.S. Congress and state legislators to oppose GMO food labeling requirements. Now, foods that are labeled 100% organic or USDA certified organic can make no use of genetically modified seeds or ingredients. So if you want to be certain that the product you're purchasing has no genetically modified content in it, then you need to purchase USDA certified organic items from the grocery store. Looking at this map, you can see that most of Europe and China, India, Australia, Indonesia area, and a few countries in Africa and a few countries in South America require genetically modified labeling. The US, Mexico, and Canada do not, and interesting enough, US and Canada are the leading producers of genetically modified crops. The European Parliament actually adopted a regulation back in 1997 requiring that the foods derived from GMOs be labeled as such. And the following year added a similar regulation targeting GM maize and soybeans. The European Parliament later strengthened these rules to require labeling whenever genetically modified organisms make up at least 1% of a product. That's such a small percentage. So even if just 1% of the product contains something that's genetically modified, in Europe, you are required to put a GMO label on it so that consumers are informed. So what ended up happening here in the United States is that different states were passing requirements for genetically modified labeling, and despite the lobbying against genetically modified food labels by genetic engineering companies, the engineering companies realized if each state passed their own requirement, it was going to be much more difficult for packaging of their products if they had to adhere to different requirements within different states. So, in 2016, the federal government passed the Safe and Accurate Food Labeling Bill, and that was signed in 2016 and will go into effect in 2018. And this was not lobbied against because the genetically modified engineering companies realized it would be better to have one federal law that they would have to meet the requirements of versus multiple state laws. So this does preempt state law. There are some problems with this law that was passed. There's some opposition to it because it would negate all existing GMO labeling laws that were already established in individual states. The bill would give jurisdiction over non-GMO certification to the U.S. Department of Ag, which doesn't have the same rigor as independent certification programs. Also, there's language in the bill that preempts states and local laws regarding the production of GMO crops, not just the labeling. And then finally, the bill has suggested to expand the definition of natural to include some genetically modified ingredients. And there's big opposition to this, that nothing genetically modified should be included in the terminology of natural, because it would be misleading to consumers. So one of the reasons that genetically modifieds have expanded is because of pest control. So I want to discuss how we can protect crops from pests. One way is using a mix of cultivation techniques, also biological pest controls, selective chemical pesticides as a last resort, and these techniques can help enable farmers to decrease pesticide use without decreasing crop yields. Common types of pesticides are insecticides for insects, herbicides for weeds, fungicides for fungus, and rodenticides for rats and mice. These biopesticides are derived from chemicals made by plants to ward off pests. So, there are trade-offs. Conventional chemical pesticides, there's advantages and disadvantages. Advantages are that humans' lives can be saved from insect-transmitted diseases, especially in the case of malaria. Food supplies are increased by reducing food loss due to pests. Crop yields and farming profits increase, and newer pesticides are safer, more effective, and work faster when properly used, and they keep health risks very low relative to the benefits. The disadvantages of conventional synthetic pesticides are that the genetic development of the pesticide resistance in pest organisms. In other words, you have resilient pests. Long-term usage diminishes its effectiveness, and it's costing farmers more for less return. Also, insecticides kill the pest's natural enemies, so it's not just killing the pest but other insects as well. There can be incorrect application of pesticide, which causes pollution of our soil, air, and waterways. And both wildlife and human health can be impacted by the use of pesticides. So, pesticide use is regulated by the EPA, the U.S. Department of Ag, the Food and Drug Administration, and the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. There are additional legal problems associated with using synthetic pesticides that's called the boomerang effect. This is when residues of synthetic pesticides banned in one country and exported and used in another. Then it's returned to the exporting country in and or on imported food. So some alternatives to synthetic pesticide use. Crop rotation, adjusting plant time, starves pests and allows enemies to eat them. So that's one technique that can be used. Also, polyculture provides homes for the pest's enemies, and hence natural predator-prey relationships can keep the pests limited in number. You could do genetic engineering and implant genetic resistance, which is being done, for example, like in the BT corn crop. Also, you have biological control, where you can use natural enemies or natural pheromones, such as it's also called insect perfume, that can lure the pests into traps and can attract natural enemies into the crop fields to feed on the pests. There's also integrated pest management, which is the use of coordinated combination of cultivation, biological, and chemical tools to decrease the pests impacting crops. We started out this short video lecture talking about food security and food insecurity. I'd like to wrap this up by talking about sustainable agriculture. So on the screen are several ways in which the government can help improve food production and food security. Controlling food prices versus food subsidies, aiding in local sustainable organic food production and distribution, educating farmers, and encouraging community support agriculture programs, known as CSA programs, as well as vertical farming. So focusing on more sustainable food production would definitely benefit our agricultural industry. The map on the left depicts all the farms across the United States. There's currently 2.2 million farms in the United States. Pennsylvania is actually ranked number 2 in regards to Christmas tree production with 1,599 farms. Pennsylvania is ranked number 5 in milk production with over 530,000 milk cows. And Pennsylvania is the number 1 producer of mushrooms. It produces nearly half of the mushrooms in the United States. So, some advantages to more sustainable food production would be having a high-yield polyculture and using organic fertilizers, biological pest control, efficient irrigation, perennial crops with crop rotation, water-efficient crops, and focusing on soil conservation as well. A good example of how sustainable agriculture not only provides good organic produce, but also benefits the community is the Growing Power Inc. company that was established. Community food centers are local places where people can learn sustainable practices to grow, process, market, and distribute food. And this is what's going on at Growing Power Inc. In 1993, Growing Power was an organization with teens who needed a place to work, and Will Allen was a farmer with land. So they came together and partnered and created Growing Power Inc. Urban Farms. And basically, right in the midst of the city, they have various numbers of greenhouses that are growing organic vegetables as well as organically raising chickens and turkeys, goats, fish, and honeybees. It's a great partnership that's benefiting the community.